On August 11th, 1994, a fishing trawler was in a river north of Sydney in Australia when it brought in the most disturbing catch possible. The net snagged a metal cross frame wrapped in plastic, which was initially assumed to simply be debris. One of the fishermen hauled the cumbersome steel frame onto his deck and immediately noticed the bag had what looked to be a bone sticking out. When he looked closer and saw more bones inside, he realized it was a human body and alerted the cops immediately. When police and forensic experts examined the haul, the full horror became clear. The victim had literally been crucified onto the improvised metal rack, his arms outstretched on a T-shaped frame. The steel cross, roughly 6 feet long, appeared professionally welded to fit the man's body, and it was so heavy that likely more than one person was needed to dump it in the river. In fact, the authorities speculated a group of strong men would have been required to toss it in, suggesting many people knew about this disturbing act. This grotesque setup earned the unknown victim a grim nickname in the press, the Rack Man. From the outset, identifying the body proved difficult. The remains had likely been submerged for 6 to 12 months, leaving what was left of the man very badly decomposed. A forensic pathologist in Sydney determined that the victim was male, of European descent, relatively short in stature, and possibly in his 30s. He had been slain by a blunt force blow to the head, though it was unclear if he was tied to the frame before or after this event. The body's fingerprints had dissolved from prolonged water exposure, and the man's teeth had no fillings or distinctive dental work to aid identification. None of these clues matched any missing person reports, leaving the victim a mystery. Detectives next looked at the victim's clothing for clues to his identity. He wore a medium-size, everything Australian polo shirt and no-sweat tracksuit pants, which are or were apparently common Australian brands. Aside from that, it appeared that there was simply nothing left that could conclusively identify the man. Notably, forensic DNA technology wasn't sufficiently advanced at the time to exact a usable profile, but thankfully the authorities preserved his remains for later use. With Rackman still unidentified, New South Wales police turned to public appeals and forensic artistry. The forensic creation was widely circulated, and the case was featured on Australia's Most Wanted. Tips flooded in, with numerous individuals believing he looked like various organized crime figures, but all these tips came to nothing. Nearly 24 years after the body's discovery, a breakthrough finally came. By 2018, DNA technology had advanced enough to extract a usable genetic profile from the degraded remains. In August 2018, the New South Wales coroner announced that the Rack Man had been positively identified as Max Tankevsky. He was a 36-year-old Sydney man who had vanished in early 1993. Tankevsky had in fact been on the police's list of possible matches early on, but in the 1990s there was no way to confirm it. Now modern forensics finally put a name to the unknown victim, ending a quarter-century-old mystery about his identity. The identification shed light on the victim's backstory. Max Tankevsky had been a missing person since 1993. He was last seen on January 11th, 1993, leaving his home in Sydney, reportedly embarking on a big gambling trip. A habitual gambler, Tankevsky often traveled along Australia's east coast to visit casinos and racetracks, though he usually returned home within a few days. In January 1993, this routine journey proved fatal, and Tankevsky never came back. His family reported him missing when he failed to return, but for the next 25 years, they heard nothing of Max. Police had opened a missing persons case for Tankevsky in 1993, but with no leads, it too went cold alongside the unidentified body case. Despite the violent end to his life, Max Tankevsky was not known as a violent or criminal figure himself, and by all accounts his only notable habit was gambling. One theory floated by crime analysts is that Tankevsky accumulated debts or crossed a dangerous loan shark while gambling, leading to a deadly retaliation. But this remains pure speculation in the absence of hard evidence. That said, the elaborate and excessive method by which he was eliminated, literally strapping the victim to a metal crucifix, seemed like it could be intended as a warning to others. Given that all evidence suggests that Tankevsky was a gambling addict, I personally suspect that the loan shark theory is correct. Notably, the case has once again gone cold, indicating that turning up his identity didn't lead to the answers investigators were hoping for. If he had crossed a mobbed-up loan shark, this may explain why nobody is willing to talk about what happened in his last days. I suspect that if the two cases had been connected earlier, a forensic accountant may have been able to provide some serious insights into this case. That said, given the passage of time, I suspect records had already been destroyed, and it was too late. Again, though, that's just speculation on my part. On a brisk October night in 2007, 22-year-old Charlie Allen, a senior at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, vanished without a trace. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Charlie's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He had stopped taking his bipolar disorder medication over the summer and began expressing paranoid fears that people were out to get him. On October 11th, 2007, he called his sister Brittany in a panic, insisting that he wasn't safe and that she needed to leave school because people were after both of them. That same night, he left his parents strange, breathless voicemails saying he planned to flee to Texas or Florida. These were the last communications anyone received from Charlie Allen, and by the next morning, he had disappeared. That Thursday had begun unremarkably. Earlier on October 11th, Charlie had lunch plans with his father and played a routine afternoon tennis match with a friend, even inviting him to a party planned for later that night. But Charlie never showed up for that 8:30 p.m. meetup. In the wake of his panicked phone calls and the sudden silence of his cell phone, his family grew alarmed and alerted the university and police that he was missing. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of October 13th, 2007, a possible sighting provided a chilling clue. At roughly 3 a.m., a Dartmouth resident reported that a young man had tried to climb into her second-story bedroom window. The intruder matched Charlie's description, and when confronted, he apologized, claimed he was looking for a friend, and then jumped out the window and ran into the nearby woods. Despite the weird and inherently threatening circumstances, the young man was extremely polite and as non-threatening as he could be, given the situation. Police responding to the scene later discovered Charlie's backpack discarded in the woods near campus, filled with his school notebooks and personal items. They also found a pair of sneakers believed to be his, left behind near the house where the break-in occurred. Soon afterward, Charlie's 1999 Ford Expedition was located parked on the UMass Dartmouth campus. It appeared he had been sleeping in the vehicle in the days prior. However, there was no sign of Charlie himself. His keys, wallet, and cell phone were missing and have never been recovered. Further, it wasn't clear if he had injured himself when he jumped out of that second-story window, assuming it was in fact him. Authorities launched an intensive search of the area. Sniffer dogs traced Charlie's scent through the woods, and police teams combed the campus, nearby forests, and local homeless shelters and hotels for any trace of the 22-year-old. After 2 weeks of exhaustive efforts, with no new evidence to follow, the official local search was suspended on October 27, 2007. Investigators believed that Charlie's disappearance was likely the result of a mental health crisis rather than foul play. One investigator came out early in the case and advised that it was being treated as a vulnerable missing person situation rather than a crime. Indeed, a review of Charlie's computer and records turned up no indications of any threats or conflicts that might explain his fearful statements before he vanished. In the immediate aftermath of Charlie's disappearance, police followed every lead they could find. Dozens of reported sightings poured in from the public. Some people even claimed to have spotted a young man matching Charlie's description talking to a truck driver. This particular tip fueled speculation that Charlie might have hitchhiked out of New England, perhaps heading south toward the warm climates he mentioned in his voicemails. This was investigated, but it proved nearly impossible to verify the supposed truck ride without more specific evidence. The authorities periodically researched the woods where he was last seen, returning even years later to examine the swampy area, yet every search effort turned up empty. Over time, as leads grew cold, active ground searches tapered off. Still, the case was never closed, and the mystery continued to haunt both Charlie's family and the investigators who had hit a wall. Then, there was a sudden potential break in the case in January 2021. A fragment of a human skull was discovered on a Dartmouth beach, and it appeared to have been there for some time. Investigators collected DNA from Charlie's parents to check against the remains, but despite hopes, this was confirmed not to be from him. In 2022, 15 years after Charlie's disappearance, law enforcement renewed their focus on the case. The Bristol County District Attorney's Office added Charlie Allen's file to a newly expanded cold case unit project aimed at re-examining long-term missing persons cases. The DA expressed hope that advances in forensic DNA technology and genetic genealogy could provide a fresh lead where earlier efforts had failed. However, as yet, there have been no further updates on the case, suggesting that no John Doe has matched to the Allen family. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain what might have happened to Charlie Allen. One straightforward possibility is that Charlie, in the throes of a psychotic episode, simply ran until he could go no further and tragically succumbed to the elements. Perhaps, disoriented and half-dressed on that chilly night, he wandered into a remote spot and perished from exposure not long after disappearing. Under this theory, he may have seriously injured himself after the second-floor jump, complicating his ability to survive in the woods. This theory would align with the absence of any contact or confirmed sightings after the initial incident. Indeed, many believe he may have perished somewhere in the woods around campus, with his remains just never found in the difficult terrain. Investigators conducted multiple searches over the years to test this hypothesis, even revisiting swampy areas as conditions changed, but they found no trace of Charlie's body. Another theory suggests that Charlie intentionally vanished to start a new life. His former roommate noted that Charlie was well connected to friends online and spent a lot of time chatting with these friends. As it turns out, Charlie had been a fairly major figure in the early days of competitive Half-Life and had a network of friends across North America and the world. If he truly believed powerful people were after him, it's conceivable he went into hiding deliberately. Supporters of this theory point to the numerous unconfirmed sightings of Charlie reported in various states over the years. They also note that just a month before, Charlie had legally changed his name to the unusual moniker Neo Babson Maximus, ostensibly so he would stand out in the pro tennis world. In hindsight, that decision, made while he was off his medication, could hint at grandiose plans or an attempt at reinventing himself. However, a little digging revealed that this was the gamer tag he used back in the day, so the choice perhaps isn't as odd as is usually portrayed. That said, of course, the fact that he made the decision while off his medication unfortunately doesn't bode well at all. Under the voluntary disappearance scenario, Charlie might still be alive today, living off the grid or under an assumed identity. However, if that's the case, it's unclear why he never resurfaced or contacted his family in the many years since. Charlie had a strong relationship with his family, and they were the people he reached out to when he believed his life was in danger. It remains a real possibility that Charlie may still be alive and homeless, having never gotten the mental health help he desperately needed. That said, this is generally viewed as unlikely, since bipolar mania eventually fades out. Put simply, it's generally not a permanent state, and when he came down, he would have likely attempted to reach out to his family. Charlie's family members have wrestled with these possibilities and tend to suspect that something more nefarious might have occurred. They find it hard to imagine him willingly cutting off all contact unless he felt he had no other choice. In this theory, Charlie may have encountered foul play, whether at the hands of someone he knew or a stranger he crossed paths with while vulnerable. One angle that was explored was Charlie's involvement in the online gaming community. There was talk that he might have gotten, quote-unquote, in over his head with another gamer or provoked the wrong person. There are documented cases of such things happening, though generally this has occurred as the result of disputes over items in MMOs. And as a quick aside for non-gamers, these are massively multiplayer online role-playing games with persistent worlds. Basically think World of Warcraft. When police dug into the online gaming dispute possibility, they found no evidence of any grudges or dangerous feuds in his life at the time, or at any other point. Investigators couldn't confirm that any of the adversaries Charlie thought existed were real. In the absence of evidence, most believe these ideas were the result of his then untreated mental health issues. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, I've got a task for everyone. I'm looking for some cool movie and TV recommendations. I spend a lot of time at my computer working on my channels, and I need new stuff to watch on my third screen. Just to give you an example of how in a rut I am, I've watched The Departed 10 times in the last month alone. Great movie, by the way. That's my recommendation for you guys. On a warm spring afternoon in 1984, a property owner in southwest Cobb County, Georgia, made a grim discovery. It was May 10th, 1984, when he stumbled upon skeletal human remains lying in a bed of pine straw in a wooded area near the Chattahoochee River. Weeds and undergrowth had partially covered the bones, suggesting the body had been there for some time. The shocked individual contacted authorities immediately, and by 3 p.m. that day, Cobb County police officers had arrived at the scene. Little did they know, this would begin a decades-long mystery of the unidentified woman now known only as the Cobb County Jane Doe. Police cordoned off the wooded area as investigators combed the scene for clues. Early observations indicated the remains were those of a young woman. The Cobb County medical examiner was called in to examine the remains on site. It was evident the body was in a skeletal state, meaning most soft tissue had decomposed, but some things could be determined. The examiner determined the victim was a white female, likely between 18 and 25 years old, standing approximately 5'5". Her weight was less clear, though he estimated that she would have likely been between 105 and 135 pounds in life. The medical examiner also determined that she had been dead for a number of months, and that she had likely perished sometime in 1983. Due to the circumstances and condition of the remains, the death was immediately deemed suspicious. The medical examiner ultimately ruled that she had been slain, even though the exact cause couldn't be determined from the skeletal remains. As investigators gathered evidence, they noted several unusual attributes about the victim. Notably, Her skeleton showed signs of serious past injuries and medical treatment. She had undergone major reconstructive surgery to the right side of her face at some point before her death. A plastic orbital plate had been implanted to repair her right eye socket. The damage was severe enough that detectives later speculated it might have been the result of a severe punch or other blunt trauma from an earlier incident. Additionally, her left ankle had once been broken and surgically mended. A metal pin still reinforced that ankle bone. Even her footwear gave a clue. The woman wore an orthopedic insert in her left boot, likely to compensate for the old ankle injury. These healed injuries told a subtle story of someone who had been hurt badly in the past and received significant medical care. Investigators hoped that such distinctive medical history, a repaired eye socket and ankle, might one day help identify her if medical records or family recollections surfaced. Beyond the bones themselves, detectives collected a number of personal items and clothing fragments from the scene. The victim's attire provided both puzzling clues and poignant hints about her life. On or near the remains, officers found a mix of women's and men's clothing. The woman was wearing a light blue short-sleeved pullover t-shirt emblazoned with the famous bunny logo. She also wore a pair of blue jeans, though these had been somehow removed or displaced and were discovered near her feet rather than on her body. This suggested to investigators that she may have been subjected to essay before she was slain. But given the state of her remains, this could never be proven definitively. Covering the upper portion of the remains was a man's brown corduroy jacket. This jacket, likely meant for a tall man, was draped over her, an odd detail that raised many questions. Was someone trying to cover her? Or had she borrowed a coat far too large for her petite frame? At any rate, investigators couldn't be sure. Likewise, another male garment was found with the body, a light-colored men's work shirt, which had been left unbuttoned and placed over the remains. This was no ordinary work shirt. It featured an oval name patch on the chest with the name George embroidered in red thread. Another patch contained a distinctive company name, Doug Hyde Unlimited. This tangible name tag clue immediately stood out to detectives as a potential lead to identify either the victim or a person connected to her. Perhaps George was someone she knew, maybe the owner of the shirt, and perhaps that person had answers about her identity or last movements. Back at the Cobb County Police Headquarters and the medical examiner's office, the evidence was logged and analyzed. Unfortunately, in 1984, forensic technology was limited. With a skeleton and no immediate identification, the woman officially became a Jane Doe case. Fingerprints were obviously impossible to obtain from her skeletal hands, but investigators did have her teeth, and decades later DNA would be extracted from her remains. Initially, in the mid-1980s, detectives compared the young woman's description against missing person reports in Georgia and beyond. Initially, they were looking for any 18 to 25-year-old who might match her physical stats and unique injuries. They also followed up on the most concrete clue they had, the name George on that work shirt. Police traced the shirt back to Doug Hyde Unlimited, the company embroidered on the pocket. They discovered Doug Hyde Unlimited was an automotive repair shop in Atlanta. In 1984, the shop had an employee named George who would have worn that very shirt as part of his uniform. This seemed like extremely promising, to say the least. At minimum, George could potentially identify the victim if she had been an acquaintance, or provide further info on the work shirt and how it got there. Investigators did locate and interview the mechanic named George who had worked there. However, this lead fizzled. George didn't recognize the description of the victim and had no useful information on how his old work shirt might have ended up at a crime scene. It's unknown at present what explanation he gave to the police, but in the end, they found the lead to be a dead end. From early on, detectives formed theories about what might have happened to this young woman. Given the remote dump site, the lack of identification, and the lifestyle clues, one theory stood out. The victim could have been involved in escort work. This seems to have been largely based upon the logo on the clothing she was wearing, though the lack of reports of her being missing also factored in. A clay model of her head was sculpted, approximating her facial features. As usual with these clay models, they're somewhat uncanny, and it's obvious why they're no longer used. Ultimately, this forensic reconstruction didn't lead to any new tips, and from there the case went very cold. By 2011, the police confirmed that they had successfully obtained a DNA profile for the Jane Doe. This gave a new glimmer of hope, but no hits were found at that time. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about who this young woman might have been and how she ended up in that wooded patch in Cobb County. One avenue investigators explored was whether she could have been a known missing person from the Atlanta area, whose body simply wasn't recognized initially. At least half a dozen missing young women were compared and excluded through dental records or DNA, but none turned out to be this Jane Doe. The victim's unique prior injuries seemed like they should have been traceable to hospital records or known accidents, but those leads never panned out. No hospital in the region could find a matching surgical record, and it's possible the surgeries occurred out of state, further complicating the trail. Other theories have focused on the manner of her death and dumping. Who would go to the trouble of transporting a body out to a quiet, semi-rural corner by the Chattahoochee River? The location in Mableton wasn't a spot one would randomly stumble upon unless familiar with the area. This raised suspicions that the perp might have been someone local or someone who knew the back roads. The fact that the body was left quite openly suggests the perpetrator was in a hurry to abandon her. Some have suggested this slaying may be tied to a serial perpetrator, though there's nothing to suggest that this is the case. The Doug Hyde Unlimited shirt clue also presents its own theories. Perhaps the victim had a personal relationship with someone from that company. Did she perhaps borrow the shirt from George for warmth? Or could she even have been dating him or one of his co-workers? Or, if the police are correct, could she have had a client who worked at Doug Hyde Unlimited? Investigators tracked down the real George and apparently cleared him, but even so, some online sleuths believe he may have been involved. Personally, I find it hard to believe that someone would leave a shirt with their own name on it on an individual they had slain. It seems possible that someone may have stolen or found the shirt and hoped to use it to frame this George individual. That said, this is pure speculation on my part, and there's essentially a million reasons why that shirt could have ended up there. As of today, the Jane Doe found in the woods in 1984 remains unnamed, but she's not forgotten, and the case remains open. It's unclear at this point if any genetic genealogy companies have been retained to help on the case, since this seems to be a case that could be easily cracked, given the DNA situation. On January 17, 2024, a gruesome discovery was made in Dallas County, Texas. The decomposed remains of an unidentified woman were found abandoned in an overgrown, disused parking lot on the outskirts of Dallas. Dallas police and the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office launched an investigation immediately. The medical examiner's team carefully collected the remains and any evidence from the scene, while detectives canvassed the area for anything noteworthy. The condition of the body indicated significant decomposition, which at first suggested she might have been dead for weeks or even months. The overgrowth around the lot hinted that her body could have lain there for a long time without anyone noticing. However, forensic examination soon provided a clearer timeline. Despite the advanced decay, the medical examiner estimated a post-mortem interval of only about 3 days. In other words, this woman likely died just a few days before she was found. This was a surprising conclusion given the state of her remains, but in the heat and conditions of a Texas environment, bodies can deteriorate rapidly. From the remains, experts gathered critical details, including that she was a white female with blonde, partially graying hair. The medical examiner couldn't pin down her precise age, though she was believed to perhaps be in her late 30s or 40s. Notably, she bore multiple tattoos, each a potential clue to her identity. These weren't generic butterflies or hearts, and most were personal and specific, suggesting significant people in her life. One of these tattoos is extremely disturbing, but I'll go through the more mundane ones first. On her upper right arm, there was a tattoo of a scroll with the names Jack and Janet and a date inscribed June 3rd, 2012. Another tattoo on her lower right arm depicted a gargoyle statue. On one of her wrists, she had a small candy tattoo. On her leg, there was a tattoo of Calvin, from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, along with the name Jacob. And then there was the most startling tattoo, the words, "Property of Blake." The authorities haven't released where on her body this was, but seeing the phrase "property of Blake" tattooed on a person is deeply unsettling. It suggests a history that might have involved a controlling or abusive relationship. Such tattoos are generally seen in cases of partner violence or human trafficking, and in either case it's essentially a branding by another person. A critical part of the investigation was determining how this woman died. According to the public information available, the official cause of death was not immediately determined. Dallas police haven't publicly detailed any specific injuries or evidence for this being a slaying, but they did classify the case as an unexplained death under suspicious circumstances. In the absence of an official cause, the working assumption is that she met a violent end until proven otherwise. In the absence of an identification, investigators and amateur sleuths are left to theorize about who the Dallas County Jane Doe might be and how she met her fate. One theory centers on that disturbing tattoo, property of Blake. It's been speculated that Blake could have been a partner or trafficker who controlled her life. That said, it's also possible that the tattoo is old, and this Blake individual was a figure from her past, and not necessarily connected to her end. Another theory is that she may have been part of a vulnerable or transient population, which could explain why no family immediately reported her missing. People in such circumstances can sometimes slip through the cracks of society. Their disappearances might not be noticed right away. Or perhaps her disappearance has been noted, just in another jurisdiction. She may have been reported missing in Ohio or Nebraska or anywhere else, and the authorities may not have put the cases together yet. She may even be from another country, with Canada presumably being the most likely candidate. Ultimately, to me, this seems like a case that should be fairly easy to resolve if awareness of her case was higher. The tattoos are very distinctive, and the forensic reconstruction is incredibly lifelike and accurate under the circumstances. That said, if this case can't be solved in the traditional way, this is yet another case that could be solved with forensic science. Presumably, the authorities have already extracted her DNA and compared it against CODIS and missing persons databases more broadly. The authorities could retain a genetic genealogy lab to construct her family tree and find her relatives. This would likely give the Jane Doe her name back and provide further information as to her last moments in life. If this fails, there's another route that could be taken as well. Isotope analysis of her teeth or bones could also be conducted to find out her geographic origins and determine if she was a local or not. If they can determine if she was from another state, this would allow the authorities to canvass that region, with her image and details through local news and social media. In classical literature, a rare creature called the Arabian flying snake was frequently mentioned as a real, factual creature. Greek and Roman writers described winged serpents in the Arabian deserts guarding frankincense trees. Herodotus, the 5th century BC Greek writer, who is often regarded as the first person to attempt to record history in a somewhat factual way, provides the earliest detailed account. And note that I say a somewhat factual way here, because there are a lot of very questionable accounts by Herodotus, which he claims are totally real and accurate. In the histories, he claims Arabia produced precious incense, but that it was guarded by swarms of countless winged serpents that hung in the frankincense trees. To collect the resin, the Arabians would burn another form of incense, whose smoke drove away the serpents. Herodotus also reported that each spring these flying snakes tried to migrate into Egypt. They were intercepted and slain en masse by flocks of ibis birds at a mountain pass, an image that sounds like it belongs on a heavy metal album cover. According to Herodotus, this is why Egyptians honored the ibis as a sacred creature. He even claimed to have seen heaps of snake bones in a desert gorge near the Nile, offered as proof of this tale. Herodotus, who loved a good story, didn't skimp on the more lurid details as well. The winged snake's own reproduction was said to be so violent that both snakes perished the vast majority of the time. Again, I feel the Arabian winged snake legend really lends itself to heavy metal album art. Herodotus speculated that without this dangerous reproductive ritual, these snakes would have likely expanded to every corner of the world. Interestingly, an Assyrian record from 670 BC also mentions winged serpents in the deserts near Egypt. This indicates that this was a common story that was flying around the ancient world at the time. Also, as a quick aside, I just noticed the pun while I was editing this video. Not an intentional one, sadly. Later writers repeated the tale of Arabia's flying serpents, with Pliny the Elder later writing skeptically on the flying snakes. According to Pliny, he believed that the stories of the flying attack snakes were spread by Arabian merchants to maintain their stranglehold on frankincense and drive up prices. No real flying snake species is known from Arabia or anywhere else, so modern scholars have sought alternative explanations for these reports. One idea is that the winged snake was pure folklore, a clever bit of storytelling. As Pliny suspected, local traders may have spread frightening myths to protect their monopoly on frankincense. A deadly flying reptile would certainly deter casual adventurers from even bothering to go to the region. Another theory points to paleontology. Desert cliffs in the region might have exposed mysterious bones that inspired the legend. For example, fossil remains of large sail-crested reptiles eroding from the rocks could be misinterpreted as the skeletons of winged dragons killed by ibises long ago. Without a scientific framework, ancient people could easily explain puzzling bone beds with imaginative stories. From there, local traders could have realized that this makes a great excuse to keep those who want to obtain local riches far away. Others suggest the tale had a basis in sightings of actual creatures, later exaggerated into myth. Perhaps venomous cobras or desert snakes were seen leaping, and creative storytellers described them as winged. Others have suggested swarms of locusts and bats in Arabian skies might have been compared to flying serpents, though there's no evidence for this. Such comparisons could have theoretically evolved into a legend of literal winged snakes over the course of generations. In reality, there are species of gliding snakes that can leap and sail between tree branches, but those exist only in South Asia, not in Arabia. That said, these areas of the world were connected through trade, It's possible that the tail of the snake jumped and glided to the Arabian Peninsula and flew throughout the Mediterranean world from there.